want to come back to, but one of the things you said was that in earlier years you didn't think that you would have made a good co-chair of the National Association of Black White Men Together. Why do you think that now, although you may have some of the expertise and the experience that would be helpful to us, that there's a mismatch going on? You referred to that.
Yes, well, what I was referring to was that we have really lost, or deliberately tried to get rid of, the race consciousness in this organization. I mean, people probably don't want this interview to be about the name change thing, because heaven knows we've talked that to death from the very beginning in Milwaukee in 1987, and even as late as Cleveland in 1996. But the name change issue has always masked something deeper, and I've come to believe that what that thing is race consciousness. And while the original premise of this organization was race conscious, we've tried to get rid of the race consciousness both from our name and from our organizational philosophy. I'd like to quote from the September 1998 Atlanta newsletter. "The only race we are concerned with at BWMT is the human race." Well, I'm sorry, folks, but that completely ignores the lessons of history, and it completely ignores our institutional experience of why we were necessary. If that were really true, we have no business being here, and that's why I'm not a single organization.
Why is it necessarily the case that that can't be true or becoming true, Colin? Why is it that that vision of BWMT may not represent progress?
Well, if it represents progress, the kind of progress it represents is the progress of the parent-child relationship in which the job of the parent is to make him or herself unnecessary to the child. When a parent becomes unnecessary qua parent, there is still a human relationship between the parent and the child that goes on. But when an organization becomes unnecessary, people stop giving it money, people stop running for office, and it has no reason to exist as an organization.
Okay, then articulate for us why you believe that there is still a mission that BWMT has to serve around continued race consciousness.
Well, are you asking the question at the local level or the national level? Because I know you yourself have called for the abolition of the NA, and I find it much easier to make the case at the local level than at the national level.
Well, then let's start locally and see where we go.
Okay, well, because I think there is always, well, there has been, and I believe there probably always will be, a very small group of people for whom the racial attributes of a potential sex partner have an erotic significance. This is, I don't believe, any majority of the human race. It's probably a very small minority. It's a small minority that I happen to belong to, so I know that from my own personal experience, and I know that from the experience of both gay and heterosexual men that I've known. When I went to college, one of my roommates was a black man in his 30s that had this incredible thing for Oriental women. And there was something about the physical characteristics, and again, race, as much as beauty, may be in the eye of the beholder, I'll grant you that. But in his eyes, there was something about the racial characteristics of an Oriental woman that turned him on. And we could relate on that level, though he was straight and I was gay. And I've met, obviously in BWMC, I've had a chance to meet more such people than I would have met had there been no such organization. But we're in this sort of paradoxical place of having been brought together, at least initially, by a sexual attraction that had something to do with racial characteristics, and then we deny it. It's another kind of closet.
All right, but once we proceed to emerge from that closet, at least at the individual level, what is the rationale for an organization based around an erotic attraction for racial characteristics, any different from the rationale for why there should be an organization, much less a community, organized around people who are attracted to freckled people or to...
You mean like the Redhead Society?
Exactly.
Well, you know, that's a literary example, and that perhaps takes it a little bit far. But we do know there's a leather community, and there's a bear community, and there are any number of, you know, minority sexuality communities within the gay community whose right to exist, you know, may be challenged on any number of grounds. Is it good taste? Is it pathological? Well, maybe some folks don't believe gayness should exist, so heaven knows its subsets and its special groups shouldn't. But I think once you allow that the leather community has a right to exist, and the bear community has a right to exist, I think black and white men together has a right to exist.
Well, that sounds very plausible, but is this, for instance, philosophically the same kind of argument that has been made and has divided the lesbian and gay community for years over the existence of NAMBLA, a group, an organization which brings together people who are attracted to young or childlike members of the same sex. I mean, the argument there has been that the fact that you have that attraction may be real, and even if it is perhaps not necessary that you feel guilty about it, it is not necessarily something that ought to be reinforced either. Isn't that what the Atlanta people are perhaps suggesting?
Okay, but let's be real clear here. As long as one is intellectually consistent, I can have respect for it, but I really think we are guilty of some double think in the worst possible way. But let's go back to your example of NAMBLA. NAMBLA raises both moral and legal issues. What they advocate may be against the law, and what they advocate may be immoral based on how we believe that adults ought to relate to children. We also have values and mores around race, ranging from what we might call frankly racist to enlightened positions of various different shades getting away from racism. I guess what I tried to get out before and perhaps didn't succeed in articulating was that if you believe that eradicating all consciousness of race is the only way to ultimately and finally defeat racism, then it is perhaps consistent with this organization's statement of purpose to abolish consciousness of race. But long before we succeed, we will have abolished the organization.
Well, that sounds to me like a pragmatic argument, not a philosophical one, nor necessarily an ethical one. It doesn't address the fundamental issue that perhaps the people in Atlanta who are writing were trying to get at, which is that there is no particular reason why an organization should exist to reinforce attraction based upon physical characteristics in particular. And particularly physical characteristics which tend to come to our attention because the society has wrongly tended to focus upon them.
Well, again, you and I probably have had this conversation in one form or another for 20 years. And I know that you tend to focus on the philosophical level, and I tend to focus on the pragmatic level. That's true. I can only say that for myself, having considered it over the years, that I do not believe there is anything inherently morally wrong with being conscious of race, being conscious of the physical characteristics associated with race, or getting a hard-on because of that consciousness. I realize that there are many ways that can be either overdone or done in a wrong or exploitive way. And our chapters and our conventions, I think, have all experienced excesses in those various directions. We know what exploitation is. We almost know, or some of us do know, what prostitution is. That isn't to say that we condone exploitation or prostitution. We know the tendency is there. My point is that unless the premise that, consciousness of racial differences and appreciation of those differences on an erotic and aesthetic level is okay, we have no business being, and we never have. I mean, we can't obviously undo the past. The question is whether now we try to continue to reinvigorate the National Association of Black and White Men Together, or whether we just let it die in old age.
What about someone who is biracial and who comes forward and says, I understand why there may have been needed at one time an organization which legitimated and reinforced the beauty of loving a person whom one has historically been forbidden to love. I understand why there may have been a time and organization to advocate for the right of people to come together who are attracted to one another despite artificial divides that society imposed. But things change. Society has changed. The civil rights movement has led to progress. I, as a biracial person, am a manifestation of that. The fact that there is no longer a need, I would contend, for an organization which reinforces consciousness of race, especially in the sexual arena, has come. Perhaps BWT is indeed obsolete as it was originally conceived. Why can it not evolve into something new and different that focuses upon the human race, which then validates all of who I am, rather than focusing upon the degree and reminding me of the degree to which I represent divided forces and divided allegiances?
Well, you asked the question very clearly and articulately, and knowing you as I do, I think you are asking me a hypothetical question rather than one that comes from your heart.
Right, I am not biracial.
Well, maybe in a sense you are, or maybe somebody with your same genes would sit there and claim that.
They might very well, but you and I, coming from the generation we come from, probably will never see me in that way. And I'm comfortable with that. But I'm trying to get comfortable with the possibility that there may be others with the same admixture of genes that I have, who may indeed want to, quote unquote, claim all of who they are and not identify themselves as black, but identify themselves as multiracial. And I think that we have to make some kind of room for that. And I just want to know why BWT cannot become a place for that.
Well, if that's what's happening, I have to say I'm really not very impressed with what I've seen. But your question is a valid one. I mean, I think you have sort of defaulted to the pragmatic level by asking the question. And I think that if the National Association of Black and White Men Together can succeed in becoming such a multiracial, multicultural space and speak to an audience and have that audience hear the message, I guess I would not be offended by that, or at least not on a philosophical level. I think I would still feel that my safe house of identity had been abolished.
Well, and I tend to agree with you, and I think I understand that, and I don't want to belabor the point. I just thought little devil's advocacy there might bring your point out in a more salient way. I think that when we talk in any context about a lesbian or gay organization, which means by definition an organization which is based around sexual attraction, cannot validate the source of its sexual attraction, that there is indeed a contradiction. So I want to just affirm that I do see your point.
And I have a process point about it too. You know, if this had been debated, and I guess I don't mean debated like the debate happened in Milwaukee, and I guess I don't mean like the New York position paper or my paper in 1997 that I know some people read, but I think it was by and large very obtuse to a lot of people. If we had had some kind of a real interactive discussion of this point, and if I had been consciously outvoted at the end of such a process, I would probably feel better about it than I do, because what I feel has happened is that something, I won't say inexorable, but it feels inexorable, pressures, fashions, tides have swept over us. And I think it has been largely unconscious. I mean, while I think the New Yorkers have been agents of this change, I don't think even they fully appreciate how. Because their position was to them self-evident from the beginning. To a New Yorker, it seems to me, it's always been self-evident that the way that you abolish racism is by abolishing the consciousness of race. And certainly the New Yorkers are not the only people who have put that thought in print. But I don't think we've ever achieved a consensus on that.
You speak so passionately about wanting to preserve the race consciousness and how that has manifested itself in BWT. I get the sense that you feel that you've been losing something. What is it about the BWT that you joined, that you conceive of, that you valued so much, that you feel is at risk?
Identity. I joined a group of people who were, by and large, like myself. And I am so unusual that that felt very refreshing.
I see. And when you say like yourself, what do you mean?
I mean that we were people, and I do speak in the past tense, who, if we were white, and let me put some names on this again. You cautioned me before about alluding to things without really explaining what I mean. But Ruedi Brock, who owned this house before me and who was one of the founders of the LA chapter, you know, loved black men, even as I do. We got into fights over some of them. But the point is that I came to know somebody very much like myself in that attraction. Peter Kern, a German fellow who had a fondness for basketball and black men. Designed a lot of our early graphic materials, and but what I value Peter for most of all was that he was just such a level-headed guy. And you know, in my 20s, when I was tempted to shoot off on a tangent and you know fight with folks and one thing and another, Peter was always there to sort of ground me back to reality. And I'm deliberately choosing white men here as my examples because, as I think you said earlier in your interview with Paul, you know, it is people of our own race that this organization has really introduced us to in a new way.
Indeed, and then in terms of the National Association, might not Tom Horan be one of the people that you...
Oh, certainly. I mean, since we're in the storytelling mode here, let me tell you the story. And, you know, my first trip to San Francisco, I stayed at the home of Claver Canfield, who was a good friend of Mike Smith. And without telling you about any of my adventures on that trip, I was feeling a lot of gratitude at the end of it and said to Claver, "How can I possibly thank you for your hospitality?" And he said to me, "Well, you know, all the other regions of the National Association of Black and White Men Together have regional organizations that get together on a regional basis, and the West Coast is lagging far behind in that we do not have such a regional organization. If you really want to thank me, you can convene one." So I did. And Tom Horan was one of the people who attended that first regional meeting, and just by way of making sure that we didn't have an awkward silence at the beginning, I prepared a draft agenda. I didn't really care one way or the other whether anybody stuck to it. But Tom Horan was taking this very seriously. He stood up at the very beginning and says, "If I don't feel like abiding by this agenda, I won't." And so, you know, that sort of put me back a couple of paces, but I came to know that Tom is another one of these passionate people whose ego really didn't get in the way, even though you, at least at first meeting, suspected he had a rather large one. It wasn't so. I mean, he was abrasive and loud and Irish and all of these things.
And one of the most charismatic co-chairs the National Association of Black and White Men Together ever had.
I will never forget, in 1990 in San Francisco, Tom, looking kind of pale and drawn in a very bright light, addressing a plenary session of the convention, he said, "You know, as a person living with AIDS, this organization, or as a person living with AIDS, my message to this organization is that we need to be a safe place to be living with AIDS." I really heard that, and I know how he felt about it, because basically his speech was about the ways in which he had been made to feel unsafe.
And yet, Tom was one of the most powerful personalities and most prominent members of our organization.
But staring death in the face gave even Tom a certain degree of humility.
I understand. Tell us about your first meeting with Mike Smith.
My first meeting with Mike Smith. This was either my first trip to San Francisco, where I stayed at Claver's home, or one shortly after, but it was in 1982. And I remember stopping into the Pendulum about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening with Jim Ivory. And we were just there, you know, having a drink. And in walks Mike Smith, and so it was the most natural thing for Jim to do to introduce us. And, you know, again, this is just me. This has perhaps nothing to do with reality, but I guess Mike was very much larger than life for me, because here was a man who had created this safe space for me. I was not only very grateful to him for that, but also very much in awe of him. And so when I met him and shook his hand and, you know, found out that he was sort of like a regular guy like the rest of us. I mean, he was a Rhodes Scholar and a phenomenal musician. I don't mean to say a regular guy in any way that would negate that. But still, the mere fact that we could meet on such a cordial and informal level, it was kind of made my year or something.
Well, you're one of the members of BWM2 who's probably attended nearly all the conventions since 1982.
Well, with some notable exceptions, because when I was living in New Jersey in the early 90s, I had to miss some. And so now when we have the ritual at convention of having people stand up and then successively sit down, you know, I'm no longer in that action for very long.
But tell us about 1985, for instance.
Well, 1985, I mean, obviously, I was on the planning committee for that one. You and I spent a lot of late nights planning the program for that convention, and so when it actually came, the whole thing went past as kind of a blur. You know, we were so busy doing the necessary that, yes, I remember Pat Russell addressing us, and I remember Mayor Bradley, and of course, I remember Perry Watkins, who, although he was not our keynote speaker, was a banquet speaker, and I had the privilege of introducing Perry. He had sued the United States Army for reinstatement and back pay when they discharged him, and I believe it was a dishonorable discharge on the basis of his gayness. When he had disclosed on his original enlistment papers that he was gay back in the early 60s, but as Perry said, you know, they needed cannon fodder in those days, and I was cannon fodder. I mean, I survived when I became part of the military bureaucracy, and I was good at it, but, you know, when they no longer needed me, they decided to raise that issue, which had been in the paperwork from the very beginning.
And he was near retirement when they decided...
Well, right. They had decided to discharge him in just such a way as would have denied him his retirement. So he sued, and he became something of a cause célèbre for the gay organizations that were funding his litigation. And the rather interesting thing there was that while the case was litigated in such a way as to try to make it a basic civil rights case about discrimination against gay and lesbian persons, he won on a very narrow ground of estoppel. You can't know the truth, ignore the truth, and then take advantage of the truth to do a man out of his retirement.
Well, let's hear it for Sergeant Watkins, who was indeed not merely an outstanding officer and an outstandingly open gay man, but was a proud African-American man as well. I know that we're focusing primarily here on the National Association, but you've been a close associate of two people who were involved in BWT and involved in BWT at a time when the National was the dog being waved by the tail. Reggie Williams and Phil Wilson. Tell us a little bit about them and the extraordinary men they became coming out of BWT rather than always perhaps acting within the context of BWT.
Well, you know, it's hard to discuss phenomena, and I believe both Reggie and Phil, in their ways, were and are phenomena. I mean, when I think of Reggie, what I think of most is his personality, his love, which was not just in that 500-watt smile that he had, but it sort of radiated through all of Reggie's body. And I have to say, I had occasion recently, I think it was April 29th, to attend a celebration of Reggie's life that was arranged by Al Cunningham in San Francisco, and Phil was, I believe, the last speaker there. But to talk with Wolfgang Schreiber, who was Reggie's partner at the end of his life. And it was eternally perplexing and annoying to Wolfgang how everybody that Reggie ever touched, came to at least imagine that they were on such intimate terms with Reggie as that they would call at most inappropriate hours and demand to see him or speak to him. I mean, I got the feeling that Wolfgang was really pissed off by this. But that was the effect that Reggie had on people, and it's certainly the effect that Reggie had on me. And my feeling was at the time, the task force was going through its things with the board.
What was the task force going through with the board?
Well, what the task force was going through with the board, and again, this is, kind of subjective, and it is a little after my time on the board, so I must not purport to speak from first-hand knowledge here as much from rumor. But the sort of financial accountability that the board was demanding of the task force,
The NABWT.
the NABWT board, was demanding of the task force,
The AIDS Prevention Task Force.
was to a large degree petty and irrelevant to what was really going on. Now, while I personally am a champion of financial accountability, and I feel that a lack of financial accountability ultimately did the task force in when it became its own organization, my feeling at the time was, well, you know, if these guys can't let Reggie alone to do what he has to do, then he's really much better off on his own. And while he was able to form a separate organization without any help from me, I would certainly have offered my help had it been asked. So I don't know, is that enough on Reggie, or is there something else?
Talk to us about Phil Wilson.
Phil, although I have known him longer, is perhaps Reggie's exact opposite in that he does not give you that feeling of immediate intimacy. You know, you yourself have occasionally referred to a certain aloofness that Phil projects. And although I've known him a long time, I still, you know, I think it would be arrogance to say that I know Phil well. But what I know of him, I respect. I think that he is where he is for two very fortuitous reasons. Phil is where he is because he's very bright and because he's survived.
I think he'd be the first to agree with you there. And he probably is America's, perhaps the world's, foremost spokesman, foremost African-American spokesman on the issues of HIV and AIDS in the 1990s. And he continues to do advocacy on that issue, and he continues to make intervention, HIV intervention for African-American men his number one priority. And of course,
and I think it is interesting to me, to say the very least, that Phil continues to use the words gay and bisexual black men long after those terms have ceased to be politically correct.
indeed, I think
That's the one place he won't compromise.
and I think that in its way shows a kind of loyalty to Black and White Men Together, in the sense that he was a former co-chair of Black and White Men Together Los Angeles. He was a board representative to the National Association, and then he became the head of our AIDS prevention team here in Los Angeles. And gradually, through the process, the political, the fundraising, the HIV process that BWMT took him through and accompanied him through and supported him through, he emerged on the national and the international scene. And you've been there for quite a bit of that and had the opportunity, and are indeed now having the opportunity, to work with him.
And it is a privilege.
How do you feel that Black and White Men Together National has contributed to African American leadership on HIV?
Well, I know that you have sometimes referred to it as a training school, and maybe it was that. But I don't know that any other... There may have been other experiences which would have served as well. So I don't think that is, you know, a unique or an indispensable contribution.
Let me put it another way. Do you think Reggie and Phil would have played the role nationally in HIV for African Americans had they not come through BWMT? Were their personalities so powerful that BWMT was just happened to be the conduit, or were they drawn to BWMT because of something that contributed to what?
Well, both of them have been in relationships with white men, and we know that. So, I mean, that part of it wasn't happenstance.
Indeed, indeed.
But that, of course, is the cross that they have borne. Because that's the stone that the Afrocentrists always throw.
So BWMT is, on the one hand, undermined by those who feel that that it as an organization and as a concept overemphasizes race, and it is also assaulted and attacked, and its leadership challenged by those who feel that it imbues its African American members with too little a sense of loyalty to their race.
Oh yes, we take it on all sides.
So, is the National Association of Black and White Men Together viable, being so buffeted at this point? What role does it have to play?
Well, I think that 1999 and the convention in Philadelphia will be a pivotal year. We're going into it at this time with one co-chair who I understand does not intend to run again, having impeached the other. So we are, at least at the co-chair level, riding on a clean slate. And what kind of leadership emerges from the Philadelphia Convention, I think, will decide the question you've just asked.
You mentioned briefly the sort of division that you said you were part of within BWMT National, white men assuming a certain kind of duties and black men in the organization assuming another kind of duties. What other examples of that are there, have you seen in BWMT? And describe that division a little bit more, would you?
Okay, well, the division I think that we were talking about was one between white men performing administrative functions and black men becoming spokespersons for the organization. And the clearest example of this that I have direct experience of was John Bush and Tim Wilson. Because while I do not doubt John Bush's administrative capability, what we remember him for is his voice. His voice as a poet, writer, shaman, all of the things that John was and is. And Tim, on the other hand, could talk about process and could talk about us as family. But if you asked him which family we were, that probably would have confused him.
What about Tom Horan and James Creedle?
Well, that's much less clear, because both of them were forceful and effective spokespeople for the organization. But yet, on issues of race, James got to do all the talking. Or almost all.
And you feel that this was something that Tom allowed, or was it part of the same sort of deference?
Well, I don't see that those two are mutually exclusive. If Tom allowed it, it may have been out of an attitude of deference.
Ah, okay. Were there, has this been a good thing? Has this served BWMT?
Actually, I don't think it's a good thing. Well, I would like to see a BWMT in which both of its co-chairs, black and white, were effective spokespeople for the organization and delegated the administrative BS to levels far below the level of co-chairship. I mean, I know at the beginning, the co-chairs have to do it all. But I would like to see them become more, rather than less, spokespeople for the organization rather than mere administrators.
There's been some talk about what's gone on in some of the past NA conventions in the Black Caucus. What do you remember of the White Caucuses?
Well, I remember sometimes it has been very difficult to even get a conversation going. There are sort of awkward lapses and silences and pauses where the conversation seems to drop. But I think there has been an evolution over the number of years I've been going to convention where the white caucuses are more meaningful now. Also, I think, given the history that the black caucuses have been so passionate, there's a sense that we are somehow failing if we don't get to that level ourselves. Whereas I think there's a recognition now that we can succeed at a white caucus at a much lower level because maybe there is something inherent about the dynamic of being, a minority race in the larger society, which makes the experience of coming together in a safe space more meaningful to that group than to the group which is, or at least has been perceived to be, the majority for most of the time.
So then do you believe that white and black caucuses, distinct from one another, have an appropriate place in
Definitely.
BWT?
And the point is, or the point I would like to make is that even if there were no white caucus, the black caucus should be allowed to exist because it's helpful.
Oh, in what sense do you think it's helpful?
Well, I have not been there, heaven knows. But the hearsay that I have heard is that it is helpful to those who went.
What has been your most memorable interaction in or through BWT as a result of your involvement with BWT? And if you can't name one, go ahead and share with us a few.
Most memorable. Well, I guess among the most memorable is also among the most painful. I was present at the debate on the name change thing in Milwaukee in 1987. And while I have heard it said that, Mike Smith was the aggressor during that debate, I also remember that there were some pretty vitriolic attacks on Mike at that convention, which, culminated in, at the talent show that evening, a New Yorker I will not name said he wished Mike would drop dead. And they've said that in print subsequently. So that was memorable, but it wasn't pretty.
Any others that you'd like to share?
Well, I remember going to the 1983 convention in Columbus, and at least from Denver on, Mike and I were on the same plane, and he loaned me his copy of Alice Walker's The Color Purple, and it was one of the joys of that convention to be able to read it.
And this came to you via a white member of Black and White.
Yes.
Are there any other lessons that you feel that you've learned in BWT